Another aspect of the spread of specifically Spanish power was the reading of the requirement, the requiremento. Essentially, the main way that the Spanish enacted authority over native spaces was through the reading of the requirement. Essentially, it was a statement that indicated that God had established the Pope's authority through Peter, and that the Pope had given the Spanish kings the natives' land. And so this is a statement of, we are in control now because God gave power to Peter, who gave it to the Pope, who gave it to the Spanish king. In it, the natives were encouraged, in quotation marks, to submit. They were to allow evangelizing or face military attack. The Spanish were very ritualistic in conquering a land. They would go about reading this requirement, then they would enact the warfare. Warfare was enacted to cause the natives to submit to Catholicism, as well as the rightful representatives of the Church of the Spanish. If the natives did not submit, they would experience violence. The army would come in. Now, while there's an ideal here of what would take place, and when you think about it, first of all, the document is in Spanish. So the natives actually knowing what you're saying, where they could say, yes, we will submit to allowing missionaries to come in, is impossible. Often, apparently, it was read at full speed. And so read very fast in Spanish. And it may or may not have been read before an audience. And so they might do it at night. Oh, well, nobody responded, let's go in and attack. But the idea was you had to read it. So even though it would be read in such a way where the natives could not or did not understand what was being said, the idea was you have to read it. It's possible that there is some evidence of Islamic influence here, particularly through the philosopher Averroes. Certain schools of Islamic thought require the announcement of Islam to a people, destined to be punished by God through warfare. And so God had determined that this people was going to be punished. Muslims were going to punish them through warfare. And so the people would then be given the opportunity, invited to accept Islam and avoid warfare. The Spanish also required tribute taxes if a government was, or if a people was going to submit to them, much like Islamic governments when they conquered a group. So there may have been a holdover here from Islamic control of Spain. Now, certainly there are a couple of biblical ideas that, while misinterpreted, may have also been a part of this. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 through 12, for example, says, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably, and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. But this is not necessarily the same kind of thing in this announcement of you need to concede religiously to us and submit to us. Additionally, the idea of found in Luke 14 might also have been at play here as well. Jesus tells a parable in Luke 14 of a man who is holding a wedding feast. And so when it's time for the wedding feast, he sends his servants out to invite the people, or to announce to the people that have been invited that it's time to come, and they don't want to come. So the king says, well, go out and find other people to come in. There's still room. And he says, go out and compel them to come in. And the idea of going out and finding the poor, the lame, the sick, bring them in. In Latin, compelle impare, force them to come in. And so this idea of using force to evangelize might have been also a part behind the requirement. Las Casas, however, saw the requirement as Islamic in nature. And so when he talked about it in terms of Islam. And so the requirement is probably some sort of combination of Islamic ideas and Catholic ideas that are melded together in this time. Questions about Spanish conquest. Let's turn then, and we'll finish up here talking about some things related to the Portuguese. Spain wasn't the only kingdom trying to search for gold and glory while supposedly spreading the message of God. Portugal was also interested in expanding its control in the latter part of this period and getting into the 16th century and onward as well. One area of interest for the Portuguese was Africa. Essentially, the idea of Africa was an attempt to find a route to the Far East that did not need to go through Muslim-controlled lands. The standard Silk Route and other trade routes went through a lot of lands controlled by Muslims. So the idea was, in doing that, maybe there would be the opportunity, by gaining control through Africa, that then you could push forward in kind of another crusade and take those lands from Muslim control. Of course, as you get into the 1500s to 1600s, the slave trade becomes another reason to try and colonize Africa. So the Portuguese find a variety of reasons to take control of Africa. Other places become of interest to the Portuguese as well: India, China, Far East, where here too missionaries were sent along with the explorers. There's the case of Francis Xavier, for example, who focused on teaching children in a variety of these places, and then hopefully through the children, teaching the adults. Here too, we can't deny the presence of the armies of the Portuguese Empire and how that might have encouraged conversion. Xavier and the Portuguese did have some success among the lower castes of Indian society, who saw Christianity as a way to get out of the caste system, a way to kind of move up in society, which of course led to opposition to Christianity from the people in the higher castes of society. Missionaries like Xavier, however, often faced difficulty with the Portuguese military, because the Portuguese became concerned that conversions would affect trade. And here it becomes one of the challenges for a lot of these European leaders. What happens when these people who we are trying to control do convert? How do we treat them now? Now that our Christian brothers and sisters. Again, to us it might be simple of how you should treat them. But to them, it becomes a concern, because if we convert them, then we have to treat them fairly. We can't oppress them. We can't do a variety of other things. Xavier will eventually travel to Japan, successful there as well to some extent, but persecution of Christianity after his death led the church in Japan to essentially almost disappear. He does attempt to go to China, but the Chinese tend to be very suspicious of outsiders, and so he doesn't really make much success there. For Xavier and a lot of the Portuguese missionary efforts, it was much like the Spanish. The emphasis is on making indigenous peoples European. You give them European names, you make them wear European dress, you encourage or enforce other types of habits of Europeans. A later missionary to this area, much later, technically more Reformation period, Matteo Ricci. He is a Jesuit. The Jesuit order develops as a response to some of the things in the Reformation. But I'll just bring him up and kind of tie this end off. He does have some success going into China. His efforts, however, are different. instead of trying to get other people to learn European languages, right, Portuguese, adopt European dress, he decides to learn Chinese, learn about the Chinese culture, which did earn him some respect because he is willing to learn about who they are, how they live. And so he is given some rights, but ultimately is still restricted in many ways. His efforts, however, are largely focused on the upper classes in Chinese society. Instead of, like Xavier, who focuses on the lower classes in India, Matteo Ricci wrote about friendship from a perspective that joined traditional Chinese literary approaches with Western philosophy. And so very scholarly writing on friendship. And so that interested some of the scholars of Chinese society, and they come to see him. Eventually he's invited to the imperial court to discuss astronomy and some other issues. Ultimately, though, he tries to keep his audiences small. Any type of interactions he has is with a few people. And he doesn't endeavor to try to build any sort of church buildings. The idea being that these small steps might be better than trying these huge changes like in other places. However, one of the big concerns that Ricci has is ancestor worship. And whether ancestor worship or how it was expressed in Confucianism, is this idolatrous? They're not calling them gods, but they are venerating them. They're offering sacrifices to them. And so how do we deal with this particular issue? And so that becomes a challenge as well. Last area to talk about for Portuguese colonization is Brazil. In Brazil, the Portuguese imported slaves from Africa to help with the trade. Often missionaries, some missionaries, not all of them, found themselves at odds with the colonists because the colonists would mistreat, be extremely cruel to the indigenous peoples as well as the slaves. Others, on the other hand, were open to using the fear inspired by the Portuguese army to provide an opportunity to preach. So on one side you have people saying, hey, this is not right. Others saying, well, let's use that force and try to leverage conversion. One of the main things that you see, though, in both Spanish lands in the Americas and Portuguese land are the development of hybrid movements. Some of this intentional, some of it unintentional. But essentially, a lot of the preaching of some of these missionaries, these European missionaries, was often an attempt to try and make equations between certain saints in Catholicism and holy people in the minds of the indigenous people, right? And so you kind of make them equivalent. So this saint, well, that saint is actually just, or your holy person is actually this saint. So you develop this kind of hybridity of Catholicism that is not the strict Orthodox Catholicism of European Catholics, but something that is kind of an equivalence of some aspects of Catholicism and some indigenous views. But it did raise a lot of questions for these Christian missionaries. Who are these people not described in the Bible? And so the concern is, well, how do we understand this? Because we don't know, we can't fit them in the Bible. And so that led them to ask a variety of questions. In thinking and looking at their practices, sometimes they found similarities. Well, this kind of seems similar to this particular practice that we do. So, Scripture teaches that the apostles went everywhere preaching the world, right? So, did they reach the Americans? Now, it seems unlikely the apostles actually reached the Americans. But, this is one way that people try to explain it. So, maybe the apostles some apostles, Andrew, for example, maybe Andrew had reached the Americans and had converted these people 1,400 years ago, and eventually it's kind of morphed into this practice that it is today, morphed into idolatry. Others, however, said, no, what we see here is demonic or Satan imitating Christian practices. So he's trapped them and deceived them into these practices. But then also it's a question of, what about the previous generations? Were those generations prior to the arrival of Catholicism on these shores, were those generations damned to hell because they had never heard the Christian message? What happens to all of these people that have lived before 1492, right? And how does that? And so that became a challenge as well, as Christians tried to work out and think about, how do you understand Native Americans and the European role in participating with Native Americans? What questions, comments? All right, well, we'll go ahead and end there today. On Thursday, we'll pick up with culture and society, looking at some things related to church and state, other things related to how culture and society interacted with Christianity. Don't forget the variety of assignments coming up over the next couple weeks as we get closer to